Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this next seminar in the Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today it's incredibly exciting to have Dr. Maaike Helmus join us all the way from Canada. So Dr. Maaike Helmus is an associate professor in criminology at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. But she's actually currently visiting the university, Canterbury University here in New Zealand on an Erskine Fellowship. So her research focuses on the assessing risk of reoffending, particularly for people charged with sexual offences and intimate partner violence. Her research looks at different risk assessment topics, including tool development, validation, risk communication, biases in decision-making, as well as cross-cultural validity. So I think it's fair to say that today we have an expert joining us to tell us about her work in the area.
Wonderful. All right. First of all, Gabrielle, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to talk about this and grateful for all of you for joining. So I'm going to talk to you today about a comprehensive meta-analysis that I spent 7 or so years working on with some of my co-authors, and I'm still trying to write it up, but it's been a very busy year, looking at risk factors for domestic violence recidivism and trying to give a kind of comprehensive summary of the field. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and I'm currently on a visiting Erskine Fellowship at the University of Canterbury. So thank you, University of Canterbury, for bringing me here. And I'm also one of the co-founders and the vice president of research for a nonprofit organization that I co-founded in Canada with some of my colleagues called SARNA, the Society for the Advancement of Actuarial Risk Needs Assessment. Okay, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm here in New Zealand right now, but I normally live and work in the city of Vancouver, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And kia ora to everybody in Waikato who invited me here, and I assume people are joining from all across New Zealand. I'm very excited to be back in New Zealand, and I do feel a particular connection to the city of Hamilton, where the University of Waikato is located. I lived in Hamilton for a little less than 2 years, kind of mostly around 2017. And it's a wonderful city, and I've been really excited just in general to be back in New Zealand and stomping around. From the time that I lived in Hamilton before, I absolutely loved going to the Hamilton Zoo. It's a great zoo. And so I've just included 2 of my favorite pictures. I used to participate in the activity where you could feed the lemurs. I would go like once a month, and also had a great photo of a Kia that was trying to steal my backpack one day. Okay, so kind of jumping into a bit of the context for this meta-analysis, I think an important question for any subset of offenses is, do we need specialized risk assessment tools for this particular outcome? So do we need specialized risk assessment tools for domestic violence? If we do, that can be very useful, but if we start to have systems where everybody gets a different risk assessment tool based on the types of offenses they've committed, their current or their previous, it can start to get quite cumbersome to have so many different tools that need to be scored for each individual in the criminal justice system. And so I generally kind of prefer simplicity where and when I can get away with it. So if there's no advantages in terms of predictive accuracy for using a specialized tool, then we might as well use kind of a generic tool that would work for all types of individuals or all types of offenses. So zooming out a little bit before diving into the need for specialized domestic violence risk assessment tools, start with kind of what do we know in general about risk assessment? What predicts reoffending? Many people should be familiar with the risk need responsivity model. So it's kind of a general background, and this seems to work for all types of crime, all ages, all offender types, mostly because I think the principles are so broadly articulated. But generally, we know that any interventions that we apply to manage, treat, or supervise individuals to reduce the risk of reoffending should be delivered proportionate to the level of risk, and our efforts should be targeting the risk factors that actually do predict the reoffending outcome. So basically, anything we do in the criminal justice system should be linked to a risk assessment as a starting point. Also, I do want to highlight what are known as the central 8 risk factors. So this was, hopefully many of you have been familiar with this. Don Andrews and Jim Bonta were two correctional psychologists in Ottawa, and they were the ones, them and some of their other colleagues in Canada, kind of published and first talked or developed the risk need responsivity model. And they also, in their first textbook, which is now in like its 7th or 8th edition, they summarized decades of research starting in 1990 and outlined what tended to be the central 8 risk factors that predicted reoffending, crime and reoffending. So these are kind of the biggest risk factor domains. They originally had them organized into the big 4 and then the other 4. In later editions of the book, they took out the big 4, and basically it hasn't been consistent which ones are more predictive than which other ones, but they kind of outlined this as the kind of core domains of what predicts reoffending. Now, for a little bit of context, it's not... Everybody, I think, always wants to find what the new thing is, or people start to doubt that something might not be applicable anymore because it's been around for a while. And so just acknowledging the history, the central 8 risk factors were first kind of outlined and published in 1990. For context there, I was just starting kindergarten. And also, that year was the first year that season 1 of The Simpsons came out. So that should be giving you an idea, getting pretty old. I don't even want to ask how many people in the audience were not born when this came out. But just because it's old, it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply anymore. But again, wanting to start with kind of the simplest approach, we have, and since this has been outlined, we have decades of meta-analyses that have found that these central 8 risk factors for crime tend to predict for youth, for adults, for men, for women, for sex offending, all sorts of types of domains and subpopulations. So this is kind of the model to beat. There's no point in having a specialized risk assessment approach for domestic violence if it's not doing any better than if we just focus on the central 8. So that's kind of one frame of reference that I would start with on this. And generally what you see in some other subfields, like most of my research has been from the background of developing and validating risk tools to predict sexual reoffending. And in that area, the central 8 apply, but it also tends to follow the rules, what I would say are the rules of improv comedy, which is yes, and that all of the central 8 risk factors predict sexual recidivism. And in addition, there's a bunch of unique factors that add, and you need both the central 8 and the sex offense specific. So it may be that these, apply for all areas of risk assessment, but we're missing something else. So do we need specialized risk assessment tools and models for domestic violence? I feel like the field as a whole kind of put the cart before the horse and just presumed that the answer to that question was yes. And specialized domestic violence risk assessment tools have been developed and been around for a couple decades now. Domestic violence specific risk tools include things like the ODERA, the SARA, the Be Safer, the Danger Assessment, the Domestic Violence Screening Instrument. So these tools have been developed and used kind of presuming that there is something unique about domestic violence and the risk factors that predict its reoffending. And the field as a whole, I think really more so than other areas, was kind of developed ideologically with a strong presumption that domestic violence was an example of gender-based violence, kind of rooted in patriarchy. And this, these ideological presumptions, I think, really limited and kind of focused how the field developed and what they thought were the most relevant risk factors. In terms of what might make domestic violence sufficiently unique that we would be questioning the applicability of the central 8 risk factors, or whether there's other stuff missing. We know there's a lot of unique characteristics in the domestic violence risk assessment field. Similar to sex offending, it's a type of offense that tends to occur often kind of in private, in a home environment, often low rates of reporting because there's often, always in domestic violence, a relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. So there's a lot more complicated dynamics and police involvement. Also, in particular, compared to many other fields, It's almost always known who the victim would be if the person reoffends, and that opens up a whole avenue of considering risk factor information based on information received from the victim, as well as evaluating whether characteristics of the victim themselves might be related to risk of reoffense. So there's kind of a few different dynamics and things related to this. Often, whatever the incident is that led to the police involvement is not isolated. It was part of an overall pattern of abusive behavior throughout that relationship, often consisting of a mix of both legal and illegal behaviors that are meant to kind of be abusive. So there's a broader pattern of conflicts in the relationship outside of what's kind of most relevance to the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Also, one piece of background information in 2007, very early on when I first started working in the field, this was actually a project I did for my undergraduate degree for a field study placement working at Public Safety Canada. We produced a meta-analysis of all the studies that were available at the time, and there weren't a huge number, looking at risk assessment tools and how well they were predicting domestic violence recidivism. And what we found back then is that the tools that were specifically the specialized tools that were designed to predict domestic violence recidivism had moderate predictive accuracy in predicting domestic violence recidivism. Actually, realizing the Cohen's d is even below the threshold of moderate. It's a bit more small to moderate. However, risk tools that were designed to predict other outcomes like any violent recidivism or any recidivism actually on average had somewhat better predictive accuracy in predicting domestic violence recidivism. So the generic tools were outperforming the domestic violence specific tools in predicting domestic violence. So that was kind of a first key indicator that these specialized domestic violence risk tools were not maybe working as well as they should be. And overall, even both sets of tools were generally showing lower predictive accuracy than we see for risk tools that predict any recidivism or sex offender tools that predict sexual recidivism. So it was just overall, we were kind of underwhelmed by the performance of risk assessment in this field. So that's kind of the background for the study that I wanted to talk about today, which is essentially if we weren't really seeing that domestic violence risk tools were performing well enough to justify not using just a generic tool, that made me think we need to kind of go back to the bare basics of what actually are the most important risk factors in predicting domestic violence. And so my goal was to produce a comprehensive meta-analysis going back to the risk factors, because those are the building blocks of risk assessment, is you want to consider a diverse variety of risk factors that together should ideally allow moderate to large accuracy in predicting reoffending. If you've seen me present before on some of my other research, I tend to like to give my projects names, especially if I'm going to work with them for a long time. I give them an acronym, and I'm particularly proud of this one. We called this meta-analysis VIPER. It stands for Violence Against Intimate Partners, Estimating Recidivism. So I was really happy with that. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors. Acknowledge is a nice sounding word. I might want to say apologize more accurately. Bronwyn Pearlie Robertson just defended her PhD in the last few months. She was, I think, just finishing her undergrad degree when we started working on this project. I had no idea just how long it was going to take. There have been delays on both of our sides sometimes if we've got busy with other things. But we've been working on this project pretty consistently since 2016. And it's just so much bigger, more complicated, more time consuming than either of us expected. And we also invited, maybe five or so years ago, we invited Dr. Zoe Hilton to join the project. She's particularly been very helpful in our kind of planning and organization meetings on how to kind of conceptualize, organize, and cluster together all of the different risk factors that were examined across all of the studies. So her help has been hugely important. Okay, so what did we do was we tried to identify all the studies we could that had a sample of offenders, either adults or adolescents who had committed an intimate partner violence or domestic violence offense. We did kind of keep this broad in most situations, we're kind of presuming that the focus is on intimate partner violence. What I found kind of looking over the research is people have been more specific in focusing on intimate partner violence and using that term in the last 10 or 20 years, whereas before that, the kind of key search term or sample definition was always domestic violence. And in those samples, there would usually be a small number of people who were convicted of offenses against a family member who was not their intimate partner, but those samples tended to be predominantly intimate partner violence. And so in the interest of kind of keeping things, including as much information as we could, we included both, any vaguely defined domestic violence offense samples or intimate partner violence specifically. So it's mostly intimate partner violence, but a bit of squidginess. They were almost all adult samples. Follow-up, they had to have follow-up data on a recidivism outcome that allowed us to score yes or no, not a severity of recidivism can be interesting, but it's a different type of outcome. In the criminal justice system, we're generally mostly interested in, whether they're going to get charged or convicted of a similar offense in the future, not how many times they're going to do it or how severe. So we needed follow-up data on a dichotomous recidivism outcome. It did have to be committed by the same offender. There's lots of research studies that use victim data, and it's following up self-report if they've been re-victimized. And there were a lot of studies where it wasn't clear or if they were being re-victimized in their relationship with the same perpetrator or with a new partner. And if that wasn't clear, we excluded them. Again, kind of our focus in the criminal justice system is whether the perpetrator is going to commit a new offense. And that could be against the same victim or a different victim. But so that's kind of where we were able to include some victim-related research if it was restricted to a re-victimization by the same perpetrator. We coded all data for 4 different recidivism outcomes, but we've only analyzed one so far, which is new charges or convictions or self-report of domestic violence recidivism. There had to be enough information in the study to calculate an effect size, and the one we used was Cohen's D. And a big thing was it had to allow us to code bivariate effects only, so the relationship between one risk factor and reoffending. There were so many studies that looked at complicated models of how well one risk factor predicts recidivism after you control for a bunch of other things, but you can't meta-analyze that because those multivariate effects, you have to combine other, basically if every effect size is controlling for different things, you're not aggregating the same concept anymore. And again, kind of going back to the bare basic, we just wanted to identify on its own which factors are related to recidivism. Once I think we have a good foundation on that, then we can start doing more detailed analyses of, what adds incrementally after you've already considered X, Y, Z. But we wanted to look at kind of at the basic level, what's predicting reoffending. And we had some sample size restrictions for statistical power reasons. I'm not going to go over the search terms and the key terms. I'm just going to say, my mentor, Carl Hansen, has published so many well-known and well-cited meta-analyses in forensic psychology, and I spent years training with him on how to do meta-analyses. And I think he in particular is well-known for incredibly kind of big picture, comprehensive meta-analyses, and that's what I tried to do here. And it was a problem. It ended up being a little too comprehensive. But we had very, very thorough searches, lots of different search terms. Bronwyn spent years off and on constantly evaluating and updating her searches. By the end of 2022, we had identified 123 non-overlapping studies. It's very common that people reuse the same data set or sample over and over in research, looking at different predictors or risk factors, especially for like longitudinal studies. They yield a lot of publications. But in meta-analysis, you don't want to count them as separate studies because if they have the same risk factors and you code it in the different publications, you're basically double counting the same individuals, and that's a problem. So we also had to take a lot of time and care to group all of the dissertations, government reports, published papers that all came from the same sample. We grouped them into one study. So we had 123 non-overlapping studies. There were probably over 200 kind of papers or publications within that. So we might have one study defining a sample, and there were, a dozen different documents and reports and papers on that study. And we would code as many effect sizes as we could from that. But for each individual risk factor, we would only code it once to make sure we're not double counting those individuals. So it'd be a really messy thing of, one study reports some risk factors, another study reports another, and we were kind of putting it all together to get the best estimate we could with the largest sample size for every factor. We had a detailed and evolving coding manual that we were always updating to track our decisions, make sure we were being consistent and how we were coding and organizing risk factors. Almost never do studies present the Cohen's d that we needed. It almost always descriptive statistics or correlations or AUCs or something else. And we would have to transform the data into Cohen's d to be able to aggregate it for meta-analysis. Our coding manual lists all the rules and decisions we did for that. It's very common for meta-analyses that someone codes everything and you have inter-rater reliability done on, you have a second coder looks at a subset of studies. For these more complicated meta-analyses and just the way I was trained, I actually prefer the system that every single study and every effect size is double coded. And that makes kind of inter-rater reliability a little less important, because every single thing that's getting coded, we have two separate sets of eyes on it, and then we would meet and discuss and come to a consensus decision on everything that was coded. It's just helpful two heads are better than one. Any one is going to make mistakes here and there, and so just always everything was done by two people. We did formally do some inter-rater tests, but we just haven't analyzed it yet. And also for any given risk factor, we looked at whether or not there was an outlier, and I followed a rule that Carl Hansen used for one of his early meta-analyses that people are now kind of adopting. I'm also going to add, this is so many different risk factors that we looked at, and I think this is a really fun meta-analysis to kind of once we get into it, but I'm just warning you right now, this is the boring methodology part. There's just some things that I'm going to establish so that when I get to the actual results, and I hopefully have it color coded and nicely set up in a way that we'll enjoy, but I just want to kind of make sure that you can all understand what went into it first, and then we'll spend all the time going through the results. So 123 was for the overall meta-analysis, any of the 4 recidivism outcomes. When analyzing just domestic violence recidivism, there were 105 non-overlapping studies or samples. And I'm going to talk about the different levels of risk factors that we looked at, but across the 105 studies, we coded 2,635 effect sizes. So any one study and all the different papers within that kind of study sample might be yielding predictive accuracy effects for 1 or 2 risk factors, or 30 risk factors, or 50 risk factors. And we didn't want to double count the same offenders. So if there were 2 different studies on the same sample, we only counted the best information. But sometimes one study would have 2 subsamples, like men and women. And in that case, they were separate samples, so we coded those separately. So it might be 2 sets of effect sizes, 1 for men, 1 for women. But that's how we had 105 studies and 2,635 effect sizes. That being said, though, that's to look at any different risk factor. At the end of the day in a meta-analysis, when you're combining together across all the studies, to meta-analyze something, you're only supposed to include each sample once. So we might have coded 100 effect sizes from one study, but in any given analysis, we are only considering 1 effect size from that study to not double count. So kind of a very complicated organizing system. So just as a kind of brief example, we might have coded from a study variables at different levels. And because we weren't sure what would be the most informative or how many studies there would have that would look at that same risk factor, we tended to try and be detailed. If they had tables and tables of results of all these different risk factors predicting reoffending, we didn't want to go crazy detailed, but we started out pretty detailed of coding the risk factors, defined lots of different ways. And then when we saw what we got, we found ways of clumping them into higher level categories. So let's say a study looked at criminal history risk factors and how well it predicted recidivism. They might have looked at criminal history for domestic violence as well as criminal history for any type of offense. And even within the prior criminal history for domestic violence, they might have had variables that looked at what was more predictive. Is it counting up the number of prior offenses they have for domestic violence, or just a dichotomous any prior domestic violence or not? So at the variable level, we initially coded kind of all of our effect sizes. So we would code kind of the number of priors for domestic violence, any prior yes or no, number of priors, and any prior for any violence. We would code 4 different effect sizes. Sometimes if they even had effect sizes coded separately for prior charges and prior convictions, we would just average those together to get one effect size for the number of priors for domestic violence. Then if we're looking at a higher level of analysis of trying to conceptually combine and look at what's the overall predictive accuracy for criminal history for domestic violence, and it could be defined, we'd want to include studies that looked at number of priors or any prior yes or no. If a study had multiple effect sizes in that category, we would average them together so that it's still one effect size for that study. And then even at a higher level, what I call a super category, if we want to look at the domain of criminal history, we would average together the effect size for prior domestic violence history and prior any history, so that at any given level or any variable that I'm presenting the summary of, each study only contributed one effect size. That effect size might be an average of numerous different variables that they use to measure that one thing, but it's reduced down to one effect size per study, and then we kind of aggregate it at different levels of clumping together concepts. So we could, look at many different levels. Sometimes we would need to reverse or inverse the direction of something if something was essentially kind of framed as a protective factor and coded that way, and then we're aggregating it in a bigger category. We'd reverse the direction so that it kind of would all make sense in the way that we would expect. This will hopefully be more clear once we get to the actual results. And then with so many different risk factors, I don't want to just bore people with tables upon tables talking about items. And so we organized them conceptually, and we also wanted to have, with so many analyses, some kind of idea of, well, how do we know that these results are good enough or promising enough that we can say, okay, that's a risk factor that should be included in risk assessments. And so for this, I modeled it on Ruth Mann, Carl Hansen, and David Thornton in 2010, published a really good kind of clinical conceptual organization of previous meta-analyses, and the way they talked about things, they created a category they called an empirically supported risk factor. And to say that something is an empirically supported risk factor, there needed to be at least 3 studies on the factor. The effect size had to be statistically significant, and it had to be large enough that essentially that it's a worthwhile thing to assess, and if it's changeable, to target in treatment. So a significant predictive accuracy with enough studies for us to be kind of confident of it, and a big enough effect to say this is really worth focusing on. And they set that big enough criteria at an average Cohen's-d of at least 0.15. Cohen, when he created his effect size, kind of arbitrarily said 0.20 was a small effect. Most people are familiar with that. It's incredibly arbitrary. They played around with some kind of working out what a minimum effect size would be. And this is roughly what would be a 5 percentage point difference in the recidivism rates for people with or without that risk factor. And they kind of argue based on their experience that they think that's a minimum enough difference in absolute values that it's worth the criminal justice system paying attention to it. They also had, that's the definition I used for saying what's an empirically supported risk factor for domestic violence recidivism. They also had something called not risk factors, which are basically things that they felt there was enough evidence to say it has little or no relationship to recidivism and we shouldn't be targeting it. This was a pretty strict criteria compared to the empirically supported. There had to be at least 5 studies, and the upper limit of the 95% confidence interval should be below 0.15. So essentially, we're confident the average effect is significantly lower than 0.15. So that was one thing that they had. I also want to qualify, there's differences between breadth metas and depth metas. This is a breadth meta, that it's designed to be a big zoomed out eagle eye view of the whole kind of field of predicting domestic violence recidivism, looking at all different risk factors, all different domains, collapsing things to look at broader categories. So any individual risk factor, I'm not going to remember offhand exactly how every study defined and measured it. I think once you have good breadth meta-analyses in a field, then you can start to do a depth meta-analysis, which is zeroing in on one risk factor or one domain. And you can start to look more at does it predict better or worse for some subgroups, or if it's defined one way or another, or measured with this self-report scale as opposed to that. That's not something that we were able to do here. Okay. I'm going to hopefully present the results in an understandable way. Before we get there, there are going to be numbers. I've tried to color code things as much as possible so you don't have to worry too much about the numbers, but I want you to have some idea of what's presented or going to be presented on the slides. Basically, there's two different ways to calculate an average predictive accuracy effect in meta-analysis. There's a fixed effect model and a random effects model. I can give a whole 3-hour lecture on the differences between them, and I've taught courses on meta-analysis, and I love talking about this, but I'm going to spare you. Basically, there's pros and cons to each approach. Fixed effect tends to have unrealistically narrow confidence intervals, and it can be very strongly influenced by really large studies. Random effects is conceptually generally the better approach that we want to go with. It takes into account how much variability there is across studies, and it increases the confidence intervals to take that into account, which is reasonable. If the studies are finding completely different things, that should be incorporated in our margin of error. The challenge, though, is the random effects model isn't very stable when you have less than 30 studies. And for almost every factor, we do have less than 30, often a lot less. So it's a bit more conservative. Basically, it's often easier to find statistical significance in the fixed effect model than the random effects. And the random effects is better, but when you don't have that many studies, it's just really unstable. And it can be problematically too strongly influenced by really small studies. So I include both. And obviously we feel better if both methods are telling us the same thing. And they often are, but just the confidence intervals tend to be wider for random effects. K in the slides refers to the number of studies that contributed to that variable, and N is the number of offenders across all of those studies. So it's our sample size information. We also have in meta-analysis an effect size statistic that tells us about the consistency in findings in that analysis. So we have the average effect, and are all the studies kind of really finding something similar to the average effect, and the differences are, pretty consistent with what you'd expect from random sampling error, or are the studies finding, results all over the map that cannot be explained by sampling error, and that means there's usually really important moderator variables that you're missing. The effect size statistic that we report for heterogeneity, so the inconsistency in results, is called the I-squared. Just as a basic heuristic, 25%, 50%, and 75% are generally considered small, moderate, and large amounts of variability across studies. I'm not going to talk about that too much in this meta-analysis because we won't have time. I'll just give you a heads up. A lot of our analyses had a lot of variability. So it's noisy. There are so many differences across the studies, the samples, whether they measured recidivism with self-report information, charges or convictions. I think it's really helpful to have the averages, but I just want to point out the research field is noisy. So those are some basics on how to understand the results of a meta-analysis. For these slides, for this presentation, I'm going to tell you how to help you understand this meta-analysis. The little asterisk sign means it's statistically significant, p less than 0.05. If I highlight the variable in green, think green means go, that means that it meets the definition of an empirically supported risk factor following that definition that I gave you. So both the fixed effect and the random effects model are showing significant effect, Cohen's d is at least 0.150, and we have at least 3 studies. Yellow is kind of not quite go, but close. Yellow is it's empirically supported in either the fixed effect or the random effects analysis, but not both. So maybe with a bit more data that might, but it's was in one method, but not both. Blue is mostly just a flag for me that it's maybe in an unexpected direction, or there's something weird or unusual about that analysis that I'm going to point out. And you're also going to see in parentheses a lot of variables that say RO. What that means is that there was an outlier in there and I removed it, which is pretty common in meta-analysis. In the final paper, I'll present it both ways. I think to kind of keep things a little simpler on the slides, I usually present it just with the outlier removed and it'll say RO. If there's something really weird about how it's different with and without the outlier, I might have kept both in, but usually I just have it the one way with the outlier removed. Starting with age, interestingly, age is usually talked about as one of the strongest and most well-established predictors of crime. And it's a negative effect size because older ages are less likely to reoffend. And we did find that it was statistically significant in both the fixed effect and the random effects analyses. So I'll just walk through in a bit more detail the first table. So for age, jumping ahead to the end, K is 33. So we had 33 studies that contributed an effect size for the relationship between age and recidivism across 121,000 offenders. The variability in results was statistically significant. The average effect size was statistically significant. We have the asterisk for both fixed effect and random, but it's not highlighted in green as an empirically supported risk factor because the average effect was quite small. It was below that minimum threshold of 0.15 to be large enough to make enough of a difference. So it was significant, but not a big enough effect, which is weird because we usually do see age as a pretty important risk factor. I think part of it here is that we know the biggest kind of risk periods are teenage years, whereas domestic violence offenders are already kind of self-selected, that generally you have to be an adult and maybe even not that young an adult to have established kind of a marital type relationship. So it might be that that might be a bit why it's maybe a bit of a restriction of range and age in the sample, that it didn't come up as a huge risk factor. Where studies included both men and women and gave us the recidivism rate separately for men and women, we could calculate if men were essentially more likely to reoffend. And so there were 23 studies where we were able to look at the difference in recidivism rates between men and women. And we did find gender was a significant and an empirically supported risk factor, with more than double the minimum effect size we need to call it an empirically supported risk factor. So the men were significantly more likely to reoffend. Usually, not in all studies, but it was often an arrest, a charge, or a conviction. So it could be possible that kind of well-known biases in the criminal justice system, that men are more likely to be detected for recidivism. So again, there's things that could be disentangled within there, but overall, on average, across the studies, men significantly more likely to reoffend. The next kind of demographically related variable we labeled cognitive deficits, and this was averaging 4 studies together. And this was looking at variables of either IQ, and that would have been reverse scored. So does lower IQ increase the risk of reoffending? So it might be something related to IQ or kind of cognitive testing, diagnosis of developmental delay, or cognitive problems. So anything that kind of suggested maybe lower intellectual functioning, and that did come out as an empirically supported risk factor in the 4 studies. So that's some of the demographic stuff. A lot of research and a lot of risk assessment tools tend to focus on the index offense. This is the offense that got them into the criminal justice system or referred for whatever agency is doing the assessment. So there's a lot of emphasis essentially on what happened in the latest incident. And so we had a bunch of different variables looking at characteristics of the index offense. I have more than one slide on this. I'm also going to stop for a second and explain a bit more about how I'm starting to present the results at different levels of analysis. So you'll see here for the predictors, there's a concept of the severity of the index offense, which is pretty broad. And we had 22 studies that looked at severity in some way or form, but there's different ways that you can define and measure severity. So we had other variables underneath it. And the only one where we had a consistent enough that we could kind of analyze it separately was medical care. Specifically if the index offense led to them needing to seek medical treatment. So what you see here is severity is kind of a category where there were subvariables aggregated together. And then I have indented, you can see there's an indent and then there's the dash or the hyphen. That means that medical care is subsumed within severity. So if a study had a risk factor for medical care and other indicators of severity, they were all averaged together in the category of severity. So this is just kind of pointing out different levels of specificity. So substance abuse is a broader category. Was there any substance use involved in the index? And then there were some studies where we could separate out in finer level of detail whether it was specifically alcohol involved in the index offense or drugs involved in the index offense. So that's so the indent hyphen is a variable, not indented, not hyphenated is a category, and we'll come up with a super category later. So what we saw overall is effect sizes generally, or risk factors that generally commented on how severe the index offense was, not an empirically supported risk factor. It was significant in the fixed effect analyses, but not 0.15, and it was not significant and much lower in the random effects analyses. So severity of the index offense didn't really pan out, but that specific variable in 3 studies of was it severe enough that it required medical care did meet the definition of an empirically supported risk factor. Substance use in the index offense after removing an outlier, not at all related to reoffending. Also didn't pan out for alcohol involved. There were 4 studies specifically looking at drugs in the index offense, and it's in yellow, so that means it was close but not quite an empirically supported risk factor. What you see is the effect size was above 0.15 in both methods, but it was only significant for the fixed effect analyses, not for the random effects. So that's one that's kind of maybe. Okay, other characteristics of the index offense. I'm going to go through this a little faster. Hopefully we're starting to get comfortable with the format of this. So we looked at whether the index offense also included any breach or technical violation. So with the index offense, it was also maybe a violation of a parole or probation condition that they were on at that time. And that was an empirically supported risk factor. So was a different variable that was more specific. Did the index offense also include a violation of a no contact order? So at the time of the index, they were already on some kind of specific order to have no contact with the victim. Whether the index offense included threats didn't quite meet the cutoff for empirically supported. Whether the index offense included unlawful confinement was also significant, but not large enough effect to be empirically supported. I've highlighted in blue because it surprised me after removing an outlier. If the index offense included a sex offense, not only was it not an empirically supported risk factor, but it was in the direction of less recidivism. And in the fixed effect, it was associated with significantly less recidivism. So that kind of the opposite direction than we expected. We also had a variable that there were enough studies that we thought was kind of interesting. That was some indicator of whether the victim cooperated with the criminal justice system. It was either that the victim asked the police to arrest the person or press charges, or they kind of cooperated and agreed to testify, but some kind of indication that the victim was supportive of the charges proceeding, and that was unrelated to reoffending. So that's some kind of demographic and index offense characteristics. How I'm going to organize the rest of this is we're going to start looking at the domains of the central 8 risk factors and kind of broken down different ways. And then we're going to talk about other domains like mental health variables and other things that have been talked about as possible other risk domains, especially for intimate partner violence. So kind of going back at the central 8, so these are pictures of Jim Bonta and Dawn Andrews, who kind of first put this together. And I lived and worked in Ottawa for many years, where these two researchers lived, and I've attended many, many presentations with them. And particularly when I worked at Public Safety Canada, Jim Bonta was my grand boss, so he was my boss's boss. And I can hear his voice so clearly in my head when people were giving research presentations or talking about a subgroup they were interested in exploring. He tended to be very skeptical that about a lot of kind of, generally assumed that his work would be universal and would apply to everybody, every situation. And I could often hear his voice saying, what makes you think your group is so special that, the general stuff is not going to apply to them? So that's kind of, that little voice in the back of my head is literally Jim Bonta's voice. And so a reminder, these are the central 8 risk factors. So we're going to look at those. Starting with criminal history. I shouldn't have to say anything. You should be blinded by all of the green on the stage and this, or on the slide, and this should not be a surprise to you. Best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. We know this. Criminal history, green lights up everywhere, and a lot of the effect sizes are much, much higher than 0.15. We get it. Criminal history matters. I'm going to stop and introduce a super category. So we talked about, so criminal history is a super category. It's bold and underlined. So that's aggregating all of the criminal history variables for each study and averaging those together. So 52 studies contributed an effect size on criminal history, either from one variable or a whole bunch of variables averaged together. And that domain level aggregated super category of criminal history, phenomenal job predicting recidivism. Then we have categories where we kind of grouped together, a category of a criminal history variable. And basically every way we sliced it on this slide, each category of criminal history information was also an empirically supported risk factor with really strong effect sizes. So a prior offense of any type, violent, nonviolent, whatever, great risk factor. Prior offenses for domestic violence, prior offenses for any type of violence, so that could include domestic violence or non-domestic violence, any type of criminal history for related to no contact. So either they have previously had no contact orders or restraining orders imposed, or they have violated previous orders. That kind of category, also empirically supported risk factor. So kind of no contact orders are specific generally to victim of intimate partner violence. Conditional release violation, that's kind of your conditions of bail, conditions of parole or probation, and violations of those orders in their criminal history was a phenomenally good empirically supported risk factor. More criminal history, and sometimes we're seeing that RO for removed outliers. Criminal history for substance abuse offenses was a risk factor. We also had criminal history related variables that was for prior violence, but excluding intimate partner violence, or prior any type of offense excluding intimate partner violence, having had a jail sentence imposed somewhere in their criminal history. So a criminal history serious enough to warrant jail time, empirically supported, where we had subscales or kind of composite measures assessing overall criminal history severity or whatnot. That was an empirically supported risk factor. There was a neat variable or category we looked at for evades the law, and that was things like whether the offender's history included things like obstructing justice, escaping, resisting arrest, those types of things of trying to avoid prosecution or conviction. That was an empirically supported risk factor. The only criminal history one that didn't come out is prior juvenile offenses. It's surprising, but it didn't come out. And age of onset of offending. And so this is, again, a negative effect size. So older age when they started their criminal record was associated with less recidivism. And it's highlighted in yellow. It meets the empirically supported risk factor for the fixed effect, but for the random effects, it wasn't quite statistically significant. So criminal history, unsurprisingly, good risk factor. Okay, the next domain in the central 8 is antisocial personality pattern, and that can include a lot of different things. So as a super category, bold and underlined, empirically supported risk factor, and one kind of big domain within antisocial personality pattern is antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. And so we have a category where we average together a lot of different effect sizes looking at antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy measured different ways. And so whether it's measured with the PCLR or psychopathy defined outside of the PCLR, and I've presented with and without the outlier antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, or a diagnosis of the juvenile versions, conduct disordered, oppositional defiant, all of them empirically supported risk factors. That's kind of more broad antisocial personality. Specific personality characteristics that would fit in the central 8 domain of antisocial personality pattern. Narcissism and impulsivity came out as empirically supported risk factors. Hostility didn't, which surprised me. Maybe it's really hard to measure that well across all the studies, but hostility didn't come out. And the SARA, is the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Guide, has a particular item for personality disorder with anger, impulsivity, or behavioral instability. And it was met the criteria for empirically supported for the fixed effect, but wasn't significant in the random effects. Attitudes is the next central 8 domain. As a supercategory, it was empirically supported, and looking kind of more specifically at categories and specific variables, whether you're talking kind of general attitudes, general antisocial attitudes, attitudes about crime, general kind of externalizing attitudes. So that's those beliefs that nothing's ever my fault, it's always somebody else, as well as studies looking at attitudes specifically supportive of domestic violence. All of those empirically supported risk factors. Now, one thing within denial and or within the category of attitudes is denying having committed the offense or minimizing the offense. Either, the victim had it coming or it wasn't as bad as they said it was, those sorts of things. It's talked about often in criminology and as kind of, within that general category. And this has been an interesting one coming from the field of sex offender risk assessment, where people have often been very focused on whether offenders are denying or minimizing their sex offenses. Treatment historically has spent a lot of time trying to address these issues. But what we found in the sex offender recidivism field is denial and minimization don't really predict reoffending. What's relevant is attitudes or beliefs that are not about their particular offense, but about the idea of sexually offending. So attitudes that think it's okay to rape women if they're leading you on, or that children are interested in having sex with adults, so it's okay to have sex with children. So those are the attitudes that essentially are saying it's okay to do this kind of behavior, whereas denial and minimization isn't saying the behavior is okay. If anything, they're potentially trying to protect their image by saying, I would never do something like that, so I didn't do it, or I didn't do it like that. And so it's kind of a different category. So I predicted that, like in the sex offender field, offense supportive attitudes would be an empirically supported risk factor, but denial and minimization wouldn't be. To my surprise, the category of denial and minimization was empirically supported as a risk factor for domestic violence recidivism. So maybe there is something different in this field compared to the sex offender field. We had a variable within that of whether the offender accepted responsibility for their offense, and we would expect that to be a protective factor. And it was in the negative direction, but not quite empirically supported. Showing remorse was empirically supported, but in the opposite direction. Those who showed, in the protective direction, those who showed more remorse were significantly less likely to reoffend. And in retrospect, I'm actually not totally confident if that's best captured as an attitude, or because it's also related to, I think, the antisocial personality pattern of general kind of callousness or ability to empathize. But I put it here for now, and so showing remorse was significantly protective. Denial was not, and it's highlighted in blue. There's only 2 studies. I usually only include stuff if there are at least 3 studies, but it was in the direction that we sometimes see in sex offenders, that those who deny are less likely to reoffend. And the SARA risk tool has a particular item that combines extreme minimization and denial. And I honestly thought based on the sex offender field that that was not a good risk assessment tool item. I totally thought it was not going to come out. My apologies to Steve Hart and colleagues. It's actually looked like a pretty good item. Okay, the next domain, antisocial peers. Overall, as a super category, this is the first one of the central 8 that did not come out as an empirically supported risk factor. However, I'm going to give some credit to Andrews and Bonta on this. They defined it as antisocial or pro-criminal peers, so hanging out with people who are a bad influence on you, support crime, or involved in crime. We went ahead and kind of broadened it out and made the assumption that that includes kind of the inverse of the protective factor. So it's not just antisocial peers, it's also the absence of good social supports. So we kind of grouped them conceptually into the same domain. And what we found is that as a potential protective factor, we would expect variables related to having good social support systems should be associated with significantly less reoffending. It wasn't, which again surprised me, but the specific variable where it focused on having bad peers who are bad influence, that was empirically supported. So overall, if you look at the quality, and we did, if you're wondering, we did, because obviously if you average a risk factor and a protective factor, you'll get 0. We reversed the good social supports to put it in the negative direction when we averaged together. But so broadly, the quality of their peers did not come out as an empirically supported domain, but specifically as originally defined by Andrews and Bonta, having bad social support or bad peers was empirically supported. Family marital, the category didn't come out, but I cheated on this, and I'm going to explain that later. Family marital is a huge domain in domestic violence, and most of the variables related to that I took out and I'm presenting later. So anything related to the quality of their intimate partner relationship with the person they abused, that's separate. So this is more kind of background family of origin type variables or childhood variables. It's a subset, and on average, it was a significant risk domain, but didn't quite have a large enough effect size to be empirically supported. And so within here, we had overall the category of adverse childhood was not large enough to be an empirically supported risk factor, but within that, the variables of if they had witnessed domestic violence in their childhood or had experienced any type of abuse. We had other variables looking at physical, sexual, emotional, but any abuse not specifying the type of abuse. So witnessed domestic violence and any abuse in childhood were associated or were empirically supported risk factors. In adulthood, not their specific relationship, but generally having an unstable romantic history didn't come out as significant. And kind of broad variables or categories just kind of generically indicating that there were problems in their family of origin was an empirically supported risk factor. So there's some in this domain. The next central 8 risk factor domain is education and employment issues. As a domain, this came out as an empirically supported risk factor, and we tried to divide it in the categories of education-related variables and employment-related variables. Education overall didn't come out as an empirically supported risk factor, not large enough effects. Within that, there were kind of 2 variables that we could parse out. One was just a dichotomous, did not complete high school, was an empirically supported risk factor. But low education, generally measured as a continuous variable of how much education have they received, was not related to recidivism. What I think, so usually more detailed and nuanced variables give richer information than grouping everybody into yes or no. But sometimes that dichotomy, that taxon of yes or no, is what's most relevant. And so what I suspect is going on here is that high school is kind of like a high school education is probably that like minimum threshold of opening enough opportunities for an individual. People who haven't completed high school are going to have a lot of challenges in the kind of employment area. So it might be not as important exactly how many years of education or how advanced it is. It's more did they reach that threshold of completing high school. Employment-related variables were empirically supported risk factors, and it makes sense that they came out as bigger ones because that's the education is probably more distant background employment could be more current. And we saw either indication of being unemployed or just generically having employment problems, both empirically supported. Okay, the next risk factor is leisure recreation time. So Andrews and Bonta talked about this as generally, do people have kind of structured pro-social hobbies, or do they have a lot of unstructured leisure time where they're hanging out with their buddies, potentially more likely to get into trouble? This is one of the central 8 risk factor domains. We did not have a minimum of 3 studies that looked at this variable on its own. So, don't know. The last central 8 risk domain is substance abuse related variables. Unsurprisingly, lighting up lots and lots of green. So overall, the super duper category, bold and underlined, empirically supported risk factor. And we kind of separated out where we could alcohol issues or drug issues, both empirically supported. The alcohol issues, it was a mix of variables that looked at, do they currently have an alcohol problem or have they ever had an alcohol problem? We had enough studies where we could report current alcohol issues, and so predicted well as current or any. Drug issues came out, so did current drug issues. Marijuana, I totally predicted that most drugs would be related to reoffending except for marijuana. Marijuana is legal in Canada, but also came out as an empirically supported risk factor. Then we had any substance abuse, so these would be combined alcohol or drugs in a variable as opposed to separating them out. And I'm also highlighting the ODERA risk assessment tool has a really cool item that's more than one indicator, and it lists a few different indicators of substance abuse. And there were 10 studies that had the ODERA items reported their predictive accuracy. And that particular item in that risk tool actually seemed to be the strongest variable in the substance abuse domain. So I think that item, how it's defined, is doing phenomenally well. So substance abuse, also good. Okay, recapping together the central 8 risk factors. Most of them were empirically supported. Leisure recreation, we don't know. And the 2 that didn't come out as empirically supported, I would say that's more our fault. Antisocial peers, we broadened it. If we stick to just negative peers, it was empirically supported. And the family marital, we took out pretty much all of their current relationship variables, because I'm going to talk about it separately. If we added that in, that would be empirically supported too. So overall, in terms of how things are looking for the central 8 in predicting domestic violence, recidivism, and asking what would Jim and Dawn say, I think this is what they would say. So definitely, yes, the central 8 are hugely relevant. But now we kind of want to know, is this a yes and situation? What else outside of the central 8 or specific to domestic violence do we need to be considering? Okay, financial and accommodation related problems. This is often talked about in the R&R model, or kind of Andrews and Bonta's approach, as sometimes called a minor criminogenic need. It's not one of the central 8, but they often kind of said it was a risk factor, just lesser. And that's kind of what we found as a super category. It's yellow because it doesn't quite meet the definition of empirically supported risk factor, but this is where I kind of feel like an asshole. It's only in yellow because the fixed effect size is 0.149 instead of 0.150. It is significant in both, and if we go to 2 decimal points, it's empirically supported, but just barely. Removing an outlier, the broader category of financial issues was significant, but not quite large enough to be empirically supported. Breaking it down, though, both variables looking at low socioeconomic status and low income were empirically supported. So there is something in there. The variable of problems with accommodation did not come out as empirically supported. Okay. What about weapons-related offenses? They were smattering in other areas, and I kind of took them all out and put them together, because there's a lot of domestic violence risk assessment tools, and particularly the subfield of trying to predict intimate partner homicide. There's often a lot of focus on weapon use. Have they ever used weapons during the violent incidents? Do they have access to firearms? For the graph here, I just include stabby weapons because we're Canadians and Kiwis. So, what are guns? We don't This isn't the United States. We don't hurt people with guns. We hurt people with stabby or jabby things. And so, for example, the SARA risk assessment tool has a risk factor that combines any past use of weapons and or credible threats of death. The domestic violence screening instrument has an item that's, have they ever used an object as a weapon? The danger assessment has 2 items. Have they used or threatened with a weapon? And does the partner own a gun? As a super duper category, I highlighted it in blue of just not even close. On average, it was pretty much 0. Some specific variables we had within that category was people had access to weapons or skills. There was some like, do they have military training or something that they're particularly trained in being able to use weapons? That variable not empirically supported, basically 0. If they used a weapon in the index offense, that did not come out. The only variable that did come out with or without the outlier was ever used a weapon. And I think that wasn't necessarily specific to in domestic violence. It's kind of mixed with criminal history. So ever having used a weapon was empirically supported, but the types of weapon-related variables that people are most concerned about in domestic violence did not predict reoffending. Mental health. This is a big domain, and we spent a lot of time on it, as well as trying to organize so many different types of mental health related variables and, where do they go? This was fun and challenging. Mental health also in kind of Andrews and Bonta's world was often considered a minor need. And although everybody, of course, deserves mental health and well-being, it's not generally recognized as a criminogenic need, particularly anxiety and depression, although relevant mental health concerns, not generally predictive of crime. In our meta-analysis across the overall category, right now what we have is it does come out as an empirically supported risk factor. It's just above the 0.15, so it's not one of the stronger domains, but it does count as empirically supported. However, that might change a little bit with one variable I'm going to talk about soon if we decide to keep it in or take it out, but these are our analyses so far. The category of generic mental health problems after removing an outlier was not an empirically supported risk factor. It was significant, but not large enough to meet the 0.15. We separated where we could current mental health problems and prior mental health problems. We would expect current would be most predictive, but it was actually if they've ever had a mental health problem was an empirically supported risk factor, but current mental health problems, and on average, the category wasn't. Kind of variables of reflecting general kind of personal and emotional distress or issues, not a risk factor. Separate category that we wanted to look at in more detail is particularly mental health issues related to anxiety and depression. This can get kind of complicated in the domestic violence field, though, because generally in the mental health field, suicidal thoughts or ideation or attempts at suicide is often a symptom of depression. And anxiety, depression, and suicidality tend to be reasonably correlated. However, the complication in intimate partner violence is that threatening to commit suicide or kind of there's a category of whereby as part of a pattern, whether it's intentional or not, suicide is used as kind of a manipulation tactic of every time the partner threatens to leave, well, I'll kill myself if you go. And it could be that they are depressed and, suicidal in the more traditional mental health version of conceptualization, or it could be a tactic to try and manipulate and control. And it's really hard to tease apart kind of suicidality versus the weaponization of suicidality to, control somebody else's behavior in this area. And so we tried to disentangle these variables in our meta-analysis. What we set out to do was, if the information about suicidality kind of was coming from file review or in corrections fields of experts interviewing the offenders, we assumed it was related to kind of depression, anxiety types of things. If the data was coming from self-report from the victims, kind of in that domain, or that the victim was reporting he's been threatening suicide, then we thought it was maybe more of that kind of manipulation thing. So we tried to separate those, and we included suicidality in the mental health domain if we thought it was coming from a more mental health type of measurement model. And the other variables where the information was coming from the victim, we moved that variable into the relationship dynamics section that I'll get to later. That was our hypothesis. What ended up happening is the category of depression, anxiety, suicidal in the mental health domain was an empirically supported risk factor. And so that's contributing to the overall category of mental health being an empirically supported risk factor. But where we could tease it apart, depression and anxiety were not predictors. It was suicidal that was. The SARA has an item for recent suicidal or homicidal ideation. That didn't come out. And so when the suicidality information was coming from the partner, we thought that was a threat to suicide, and we didn't code that in the mental health domain. We coded that in the other relationship domain, but I've just pasted those here so that we can compare. And originally it was coming out as a super strong variable. Then we removed one outlier, and it came down to empirically supported in the random effects, but just below the threshold in fixed effects, but very similar to what we got in the mental health thing. So at the end of the day, we tried to disentangle the two. I'm not actually sure that we did. If we recombine them and take them out and put them separately, I'm not sure what's going to happen to the whole mental health domain. So I'm just kind of putting that out there. Other mental health variables, borderline personality disorder is often discussed as highly relevant in intimate partner violence. Yellow, so it was very close. Again, it's decimal dust. It's just rounded. If we round up, it would be empirically supported risk factor. Trauma-related variables weren't. Variables related to diagnoses or symptoms kind of psychotic disorders was not an empirically supported risk factor, nor was the SARA risk assessment item recent psychotic and or manic symptoms. But borderline, maybe. We did code variables related to treatment. I'm going to have some caveats here. Motivation for treatment was significant, but it's in blue. It was the opposite effect. Offenders who were more motivated for treatment were more likely to reoffend. So not expected there. Probably a confound that it might be those with more serious problems might be more motivated to seek treatment. Whether they had completed domestic violence treatment was associated with significantly lower recidivism, not quite high enough in the random effects to be empirically supported. I do want to say this is not at all a good meta-analysis to evaluate the effectiveness of treatment because it's bivariate. There's so many important things that you want to control for treatment effectiveness where you're kind of trying to assume causality, and we didn't do any of that, so but we coded it as a variable, as a basic thing. Variables related to their attendance and performance in treatment did not come out as an empirically supported risk factor. The one that did come out very strongly was if they dropped out of treatment. This is consistent with research in other fields, other offense types, and it's also maybe more strongly an indicator of antisocial personality. But like in other fields, dropping out of treatment is a very relevant risk factor. We were also interested, there were a lot of studies that mixed people who were essentially mandated to attend treatment by the criminal justice system versus people that were not mandated. In some cases, weren't even in the criminal justice system. It was self-report. And that was met the definition of empirically supported risk factor in fixed effect, but not random effects. And this was in the direction that those who were court-ordered and referred were less likely to reoffend. Involvement in domestic violence court, unrelated. Okay. So some of the last domains that I'm going to talk about are domains that people have hypothesized are potentially unique to domestic violence, or they're specific to that relationship. One thing that's really unique in the domestic violence risk assessment field is the discussion of victim vulnerability factors. Because it's more likely to be, a reoffense against the same partner, we know who the likely victim is going to be, and they might also be giving us valid information about the risk assessment. And to be clear, this is not in any way a victim blaming thing but the idea is that there might be some characteristics that make a victim more vulnerable, that might be more likely for offenders to reoffend against certain types of victims. It might sometimes be that, they're barriers to getting support or things. And so these victim vulnerability factors do show up in a lot of domestic violence risk tools, and you don't see them in any other type of offender risk assessment tool. The ODERA has an item to whether the victim has barriers to support. The danger assessment and its different iterations have a lot of victim vulnerability factors of whether the victim is suicidal, if the victim has education or employment difficulties, if the victim is foreign born, that might also kind of reduce their support or make them more reluctant to go to authorities. And the Be Safer is a risk assessment tool that was kind of meant to be a shorter and easier to use tool compared to the SARA, developed by the same people. And it has 15 items in, I think, 2 or 3 subscales, and it has an entire subscale that a third of the items of the tool is a subscale for victim vulnerability factors. So these really pop out a lot in risk assessment tools. How well do they do at predicting recidivism? We didn't have a super category here because just sometimes there were too many different things in different directions to aggregate. But a lot of the variables that we thought would turn out didn't, whether the victim essentially had low financial resources, generally low resources that could be financial, social resources, those kind of barriers to support. The only ones that did come out as empirically supported were if the victim had substance abuse issues or the victim had previously been a victim of domestic violence or a witness. Health or emotional issues in the victim didn't come out, nor did their age. We'll talk whether they were currently pregnant or had a newborn. That would be essentially at the time the assessment was done or at the time of the index offense, was empirically supported in the fixed effects, but not the random effects. Okay. The next category is relationship characteristics. So we talked a little bit about the victim characteristics. Some popped up, but a lot of them didn't. And at the very beginning, talking about the results, we talked about characteristics of the index offense. So now we're kind of starting to move into the relationship characteristics, so who their victim was, usually in an intimate partner context, so variables specific to that relationship. And then we're going to get into their, not the index incident, but the whole pattern of abuse and conflict in that relationship. So in terms of relationship characteristics, a category of relationship stability was almost rounded up to an empirically supported risk factor, or protective factor, really, that stability decreased the risk of recidivism. Breaking that down, being legally married wasn't quite an empirically supported protective factor, but the length of relationship was. So couples that have been together for longer periods of time, we saw significantly lower recidivism. The category of variables overall, looking at the quality of the relationship, didn't come out as an empirically supported risk factor. A small subset, though, and this is poorly worded. The problems in relationship was kind of a generic overall. Are there a lot of problems in the relationship? There were other variables that we put in the category of relationship quality, which were things like, has there been a lot of infidelity? There was a bunch of specific stuff. And so kind of the broadly problematic relationships was empirically supported, but the overall category of general and specific variables, it kind of fell apart. There's a lot of interest, particularly in Canada. There's a bill to legalize, or to criminalize rather, coercive control in relationships. So those are really hard to measure and define. But where we had variables essentially looking at how controlling the perpetrator is in the relationship, it was significantly related to recidivism, but not large enough to be an empirically supported risk factor. Highlighted in blue, recent separation. So at the time of the assessment, or at the time, generally of the assessment, if the relationship had recently dissolved, that's often talked about as the highest risk period for violence. And it might be that it's the highest risk period for homicide, but having recently been separated or divorced did not come out as an empirically supported risk factor at all, nor did whether they were cohabitating or not. Okay. So not looking at criminal history or specifically the index offense, but looking at whoever the victim of their intimate partner violence was. and the overall pattern of violence in the relationship, not the latest incident, but the overall pattern, we found lots of empirically supported risk factors. As a super category, it was empirically supported. A lot of the variables that are discussed in the literature, so escalation of violence, if the offender has ever assaulted the victim while she was pregnant, that came out. Threats of suicide did come out, but when we removed the outlier, it fell just below the 0.15 in the fixed effect. So there might be something there. What didn't come out is dual perpetration. So when both partners had been violent to each other, that was unrelated to recidivism. And we tried to separate out if they were making threats to harm other family members, making threats to harm pets, or threats to the victim, but all kind of aggregated together. Threats, excluding threats of suicide, was not related to recidivism. Lots more empirically supported. Choking and strangulation ever during the pattern of violence. Sexual abuse in the index offense was, if anything, associated with less recidivism. So it was not relevant if the most recent offense involved sexual violence, but if they had ever committed sexual violence against that partner, that was an empirically supported risk factor. Frequency and severity. Severity in the index wasn't an empirically supported, but severity and frequency in the overall pattern of relationship violence was. Psychological abuse, not quite in the fixed effect analyses, but it was in the random effects. And property damage in the relationship was empirically supported. Okay, risk factors that have been talked about as potentially totally unique to domestic violence did come out as an empirically supported domain, not nearly as large as many of the central 8 risk factors, though. And within that subset, the only one that clearly came out was jealousy as an empirically supported risk factor. Harassment or stalking related variables didn't come out. And the SARA has an item that I thought was pretty interesting about it. What I don't like about the SARA as a risk tool, if you're familiar with it, is all of the items are scored 0, 1, 2, but a lot of the items are dichotomous. So to get the 0, 1, 2 rating system, they combine 2 items together. And then it's really messy because you can't know if you're combining past sexual assault and sexual jealousy, if maybe only one of them is predicting. Anyhow, that's their variable that combines any sexual assault of the victim along with sexual jealousy related things was significant, but not large enough to be empirically supported. Okay. This is also messy. There's a whole bunch of discussion about children when intimate partner violence is occurring, and can be in a lot of directions. Children can serve as a barrier to the victim being able to leave. They can cause stresses in a relationship. I don't have children, but I've heard that you're supposed to feed them every day and take care of them, and that can cause stress in anyone's life, much less in a relationship with others. And there's also discussion of some of the additional stressors and complications of blended families. So it could be things about if the other partner has children from a previous relationship that they're bringing into the current relationship, that can cause more conflict. Also could be an indicator, proxy indicator of relationship instability. If people have, 5 children by 4 different fathers. There also could be a hypothesis that having biological children together with their partner could be protective in the sense that it's a motivation or incentive to work on the relationship. So we tried to code as many variables as we could about children, but it was often very unclear. We were trying to sort out, were they the offender's children? Were they the offender's stepchildren? Were they children that were biologically kind of or adopted together jointly by the perpetrator and the victim? And a lot of the studies were not clear enough for us to sort that out. Whether the offender had biological children after removing the outlier did seem to be an empirically supported risk factor. And if the offender had stepchildren, that was close. But other variables, as you see, there are children. These was kind of a generic that there was something related to children, but we had no idea whose. And there weren't a lot of studies of the joint children. And when you averaged all of this together, it came out to nothing. But there's hints of something going on in some of these variables, but it's very muddy. Okay. those are the categories. Those are our main findings. This was a lot of results. I'm really hoping that my color coding made it a little easier for you to follow. But you might be thinking at this point, so much information. Oh my goodness, what just happened to me? Can we get a bit of highlights? Putting it all together, the strongest empirically supported risk factors domains, they met the criteria as a factor or domain for empirically supported, and the effect size was on the larger side, 0.25 or above. And again, you don't expect Cohen's D of 0.25 isn't huge. You don't expect any single one risk factor to have a large effect. You expect most risk factors have, solidly small effects, and it's combining them together in a risk tool. That's why you include multiple risk factors. So on their own, for a single risk factor, a D of 0.5 is actually pretty meaty. That's a good risk factor. Criminal history, basically the domain and every single subset in the domain, pretty much really strong. Antisocial personality pattern, antisocial cognitions, that's including specific to domestic violence or crime in general, minimization, and remorse was particularly relevant in the positive direction as a protective factor. Treatment dropout, and the only kind of really domestic violence specific variable that made the cut as kind of the strongest predictors seemed to be jealousy. This is a general list of other notable empirically supported risk factors, not the overall category of quality of peers, but specifically the pro-criminal peers, education, employment, substance abuse, not so much the index offense, but the pattern of intimate partner violence. There were tons of empirically supported risk factors in there. Some family and childhood factors were, low socioeconomic status and low income were. Mental health just barely made this list, but weirdly, it was more prior mental health than current mental health. And the suicidality thing just really confuses things, and I'm not sure I've got a good handle on that yet. Motivation was a risk factor, not a protective factor. Obviously, I don't think it makes sense to try and demotivate offenders to reduce crime. I think that's probably one of those confoundy things. Some victim vulnerability factors were empirically supported, but really not a lot. Length of relationship was protective. Problems in the relationship, empirically supported. Manadel had a category of unsupported overall, but with interesting exceptions. So peers we've talked about. The weapons, it's ever used a weapon that was, but the overall weapons not supported. And I also wanted to highlight children on average unsupported, but I think there might be something there if we can actually disentangle who these children are, who do they belong to. So I think we need to look into that a bit more. Now, not a risk factor. Mann et al. Said to kind of, be confident something was not a risk factor, you need at least 5 studies, and the upper limit of the confidence interval should be lower than a D of 0.15. And with the amount of variability I had in the studies, very few things came out as under that definition, clearly not a risk factor. Usually there's not enough studies to conclude that. With high confidence, cohabitation and recent separation would make that list. If I broaden their definition a little bit, where the average Cohen's D is less than 0.10, or it might meet their definition, but there's less than 5 studies, or the confidence interval isn't less than 0.15, but it's less than 0.20. So if I broaden it up just a little bit, these are some variables that didn't make the cut as a risk factor. Highlighting where I think we really need more research. I didn't include some variables if there were only 1 or 2 studies, but we want more research on it. And so these are one that we had 2 studies, and it was significant in the fixed effect and or random effects analyses, and the Cohen's D was looking quite good. One is if the victim reported the offense. So it didn't quite pan out if the victim was cooperating with the criminal justice system or not, but if it was that the criminal justice system got involved because the victim reported it as opposed to like a neighbor or something, that did seem quite promising. Multiple victims in the index offense came out as promising. Criminal versatility. If you've been trained on scoring the psychopathy checklist revised, I think their criminal versatility item is one of the most interesting risk factors that needs a lot more attention in general. I think it's a great concept, not just the length of criminal history, but kind of the diversity of someone's criminal history. and that came out as really promising here. And personally, I think it's a really fascinating risk factor. I'd love to know more about it. And kind of 2 variables looking at deceitfulness came out quite strong. Some limitations to the research. No one's examining leisure recreation time. We just don't know a lot. A lot of studies we couldn't include because they only reported multivariate analyses. So they only had variables predicting recidivism after controlling for all sorts of other things. And we couldn't figure out what was the basic on its own relationship between that variable and recidivism. So just a reminder, if you're a researcher in the audience, doing complicated multivariate analyses is great, but you should always have a table that reports your bivariate analyses. And there's a lot of noise in the data and methodology. And an important caveat that this is looking at predicting any domestic violence recidivism, not the severity of reabuse. That is a different outcome. Overall, kind of big picture summary, I kind of talked at the beginning in 2007, we found that general risk assessment tools seem to be doing a bit of a better job predicting domestic violence recidivism than domestic violence risk tools. Now that meta-analysis is getting quite out of date. But I think generally the performance of domestic violence risk assessment tools has been fairly underwhelming compared to other fields. Based on overall all of my experience with developing and validating risk assessment tools in a variety of domains, and just kind of, and my knowledge of many of the domestic violence specific risk assessment tools out there, I can vary and have comments on each tool individually. But overall, I think most domestic violence risk assessment tools out there are a bit out of whack in their focus. Many of them disproportionately focus on things specific to domestic violence, and they generally exclude a lot of central 8 risk factors, or they underweight them. I think just overall the tools have focused too much on what's unique to domestic violence and have neglected what's kind of universally predictive of crime. A lot of domestic violence risk tools include usually multiple items that are not empirically supported risk factors. They almost all omit key risk factors, usually ones from the central 8. Also, there is a tendency in many domestic violence risk assessment tools to place too much focus on variables related to the index offense, which generally aren't predictive, as opposed to the overall pattern of violence. So I guess pros or cons, I think the performance of existing domestic violence risk tools is underwhelming. I think that there is potential for a lot of improvement in risk assessment tools, especially I think if we can get a better balance of central 8 and domestic violence specific risk factors, and make sure that we're not including the ones that, aren't actually predictive.